Hello, Amber and Gianluca. I see you finished the 60 years of Rocky and Bullwinkle documentary, and I hope you guys at home like it.
Hello, Amber and Gianluca, darlings. I hear you finished the 60 years of Rocky and Bullwinkle documentary. I hope you didn't work too hard. I really hope you guys at home like it. If you don't, you can unsubscribe.
Hello, Amber and Gianluca. I hope you finished the 60 years of Rocky and Bullwinkle documentary. And I really hope you guys at home like it. Otherwise, unsubscribe!
Hello, Amber and Gianluca. Congratulations on your fan film chronicling the history of Rocky and Bullwinkle. If you ever receive a residual check of any kind, just give me a call and I can afford you my address to forward the payments. Thank you so much. Also, I only receive payments in fresh fruit. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hokey smokes, Amber and Gianluca! I see you finished the documentary. Sorry if my voice sounds a bit different. It's actually Amber doing my voice, not Tara. She was too busy to do it, so Amber's had to step in. I hope Tara's really proud of her, by the way, and I also hope you guys at home love the documentary too.
It's been 60 years since a talking moose and squirrel hit our screens.
From the magic of Jay Ward and Bill Scott, these mammals became a global hit around the world. But how did they do it?
What happened in the present day? This documentary features interviews with cast members both old and new.
Amber the Fangirl and Thomas and TUGS Man are proud to present you Hokey Smokes, celebrating 60 years of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
The story of Rocky and Bullwinkle all begins back in 1958 with the two creators of the show, Jay Ward, an American cartoon producer who worked on an old cartoon called Crusader Rabbit back in 1950, and William John Scott, often known to his friends as Bill Scott. He was also an American cartoon producer as well as a writer and voice actor. The full story begins with the late June Foray, Bill Scott and Jay Ward having a lunch out in Los Angeles. According to an interview with June, when she was first approached with the idea, she had one martini, and she thought it was a cockeyed idea. But by the time she had the second martini, she thought it was a brilliant idea. So 1 week later, production began, with the cast and the animation team.
The voices for the show were primarily done by June Foray, Bill Scott and Paul Frees. June was the voice of Rocky, Natasha Fatale, and most of the female characters in Fractured Fairy Tales. Bill was the voice of Bullwinkle, Gidney, Mr. Big, and Fearless Leader. And Paul was the voice of Boris Badenoff, Cloyd, and Captain Peachfuzz. William Conrad, best known as Frank Cannon and Nero Wolfe, was the narrator. Fractured Fairy Tales was narrated by Edward Everett Horton. Aesop and Son were voiced by Charles Ruggles and Dawes Butler. Mr. Peabody and Sherman were voiced by Bill Scott and Walter Tetley, and Dudley Do-Right, Nell Fenwick, Inspector Fenwick and Snidely Whiplash were voiced by Bill, June, Paul, who also narrated the Dudley segments, and Hans Conried, respectively.
Funnily enough, Bullwinkle was actually the final character to receive his voice, after Bill Scott asked, "Who's going to play Bullwinkle?" and Jay Ward replied, "I thought you were playing Bullwinkle." This was due to the fact that Bill Scott would often intimidate the characters whilst reading the script, and Bullwinkle's voice kind of stuck with the cast, and ever since then, Bullwinkle has been voiced by Bill Scott.
The show was animated by Gamma Productions of Mexico, as it was cheaper to get it animated in a foreign country than America. Jay Ward was never satisfied with their work, as it was crude and substandard, sloppily done, and very limited. By the time it was on the air, it was too late. Loads of errors had been spotted. Boris's moustache disappeared for a few frames, mouths and noses were missing, and so on. Production then moved to America in the 1960s.
The first shows were all animated in Mexico. I knew nothing about this, as a matter of fact, until the day we were to sign the contracts. Jay was ill and could not make it to the meeting, and he hadn't clued me into a thing. And as we were walking across the parking lot to the meeting with the sponsor of the network and who else, the gentlemen who were instrumental in putting the show together bracketed me like two tame elephants and the rogue elephant, and they said, if you hear us say anything about Mexico, say we can do it. Yeah, all right, okay, sure. But the first question was, do you think you can really do this in Mexico? Why, certainly, I said. I had the faintest idea if we could do it in Mexico. And as it turned out, we couldn't. Yeah, it was so, the talent was not there, the experience was not there. And from the first episode, Jay did his best to haul it back across the border, to finally, at the end of it, almost all the material was being done in this country.
With choppy animation like that, you think that the series would never take off, but with great comedy and great voice acting, ABC got the rights, and on November the 19th, 1959, Rocky and his friends, the Jet Fuel Formula, made it to the TV. Jet Fuel Formula holds the record for having the most segments in a Rocky and Bullwinkle short, with 40 in total. One interesting thing about the early series of Rocky and Bullwinkle was how many times the characters changed their designs. Rocky changed a little bit in 1961, but Fearless Leader changed so many times in Jet Fueled Formula.
A few characters have gone through design changes throughout the show's run, the most notable changes happening to Fearless Leader. First, he was slim, wearing a trench coat and disguised himself with sunglasses and a hat. Then, he was large and fat. Then he changed again, and again, until the final design with the monocle and scar around the beginning of Season 2. According to TV tropes, Pottsylvania had many different fearless leaders who were thrown overboard, which is why they have changed, but this is highly unlikely as they all have the same style of voice.
Another character that suffered design changes was Boris. At first, he had red eyes, but then later on in the series, he had white eyes, which doesn't make sense because in merchandise, especially in the plush toys, he had red eyes. But other than that, the show was a massive success and appealed to both children and grown-ups alike. This is an old recording of the old airings of Rocky and his friends from 1960.
A thunder of jets in an open sky, a streak of gray and a cheerful... A loop, a whirl, and a vertical climb, and once again, you know it's time for Rocky and his friends. Starring that supersonic speedster, Rocket J. Squirrel, with his pal Bullwinkle the Moose, and a host of others.
Sometimes there's a person called Ponsonby Britt OBE who is sometimes credited in Rocky and Bullwinkle. But what was funny about him is that he was actually a fictional character created by Jay and Bill. But other than that laugh, the show had a great run. The show lasted on ABC from 1959 to 1961. However, in 1961, ABC lost the contract. It is still unknown why they lost the contract, but they moved to NBC in 1961 and was renamed The Bullwinkle Show. But what was inconsistent is that the title changed 3 times whilst being on NBC. Once, it was called The Bullwinkle Show, and then some airings it can be called The Rocky Show, and in other airings it can be called The Adventures of Bullwinkle and Rocky. But despite the title changes, the show was still the same. The show lasted 27 episodes in the span of 5 years and 2 networks. The story premise of Rocky and Bullwinkle was fairly simple. It follows the adventures of 2 best friends, Rocket J. Squirrel and Bullwinkle J. Moose, who live in a small town called Frostbite Falls, which is located in Minnesota, which is based on a real-life town in Minnesota called International Falls. The show usually consists of the 2 characters going on many different adventures, but stepping in their way are the 2 villains, Boris Badenov and Natasha Fatal. They were the 2 spies from Pottsylvania, not Russia, and Pottsylvania was led by their fearless leader, The only reason the characters come from Pottsylvania and not Russia is because America already had problems with the Cold War, and when June Foray was actually asked to voice Natasha, the writers stated clearly not to make her fully Russian, so June came up with a more of a, in her words, more of a continental accent, and thus the Pottsylvanian accent was created. Back in its day, and during the reruns of the show, the Rocky and Bullwinkle show was a variety show.
The show contained a ton of different segments, like Bullwinkle's Corner, which is Bullwinkle reading out a nursery rhyme each segment, Mr. Know-It-All, where Bullwinkle teaches the viewers how to do a simple task, whilst failing, Fractured Fairy Tales, which are fairy tales retold in a crazy and zany way, Aesop and Son, which is very similar but with a fable at the end, Dudley Do-Right, The Adventures of a Canadian Mountie, His Girlfriend, His Horse, and His Boss, whilst they try to stop Snidely Whiplash, and Peabody's Improbable History, where a dog and his son, boy, go back in time and meet famous figures.
But in 1964, the Bullwinkle show itself got cancelled. To this day, it is still unknown why the Bullwinkle show got cancelled. It would be interesting to know what happened after 1964, but that's another story. Nope, we are not doing that joke.
We spoke to Fred Fries, son of Paul Fries, and Barbara Scott, daughter of Bill Scott, about their parents and their time on the show. Fred was always very proud to have Paul as his dad, and he often went to recording sessions of the show. His father was extremely close friends with William Conrad. I think the show has lasted so long because of the talent and creativity that went into it. It also touched on issues that are still relevant today. The fun they put into it can be felt. Great things last forever, he reminisced to us. Barbara attended recording sessions too. She told us, I was a kid when the show aired, and so for the most part unaware of his celebrity. Although I knew people loved the cartoons and he sometimes did really weird things in Hollywood, he made a point of keeping his home life and work life separate. He actually became much more of a celebrity long after the show was cancelled, but my dad was a pretty great thing. He was, as you can imagine, a very, very funny man. Before we continue, I just wanted to point out that whilst the Bullwinkle show was on NBC, they had a puppet that was controlled live, and it made many inside jokes to companies like Walt Disney and even the NBC Peacock at one point. But the most controversial moment was when Bullwinkle told children to pull the knobs off their TV series so they wouldn't miss an episode. This caused many parents to complain to NBC. Soon after this, the puppet was taken off air.
First, a message for all you kids who are watching. Did you know that the knobs on your television set will come off if you pull on them? Right now, why not pull off the knob that changes the channels? It's loads of fun, and that way you'll be sure to be with us next week. And the week after that, and the week after that, and the week after...
Ever since the Bullwinkle show was cancelled in 1964, Jay Ward decided to bring back the show to ABC, and they were given a brand new look to the show with the new Rocky and Bullwinkle and Friends logo. This is a classic example of film restoration. The best example of film restoration I can think of is the original airings and episodes of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. In the early episodes, they had the original Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends logo, but when they were restored on DVD, they were given the brand new Thomas and Friends logo. But unlike Thomas, where certain shots were changed in the restored versions, especially this example from the episode Cold from season 1, everything stayed the same in Rocky and Bullwinkle, even the animation errors. But this wasn't the end for the team. Jay Ward and Bill Scott would go on to create two new shows in 1964 and 1967.
After the cancellation of the Bullwinkle show, Jay Ward and Bill Scott created two new shows in the years following. Hoppity Hooper was the first in 1964. The show's plot was simple. A frog named Hoppity Hooper, voiced by Chris Allen, went on adventures with his uncle, Waldo Wigglesworth the Fox, voiced by Hans Conried, and his friend, Fillmore Bear, voiced by Bill. They all lived in Foggy Bog, Wisconsin. Not much is known about Chris Allen, considering this and Hanna-Barbera's Space Cadets were her relatively only known shows she's done. Dawes Butler introduced her to Jay and Bill, and the rest is history. The pilot was very different too. Alan Reed, the original voice of Fred Flintstone, was to voice Fillmore Bear, but he then became under contract to ABC for the Flintstones. Hoppity Hooper was on NBC, so he was replaced with Bill.
Whoa, Waldo, it's growing hair.
Hey, Waldo, that's the last of this batch.
I'm sorry, folks, that's all for today.
Oh, that's so bad. Just one more.
I quite like this show. I'd recommend it 10 out of 10. Next came George of the Jungle in 1967.
George of the jungle, strong as he can be. Watch out for that tree.
The show followed a Tarzan-like character named George and his friend Ursula, whom George refers to as Fella, along with an ape named Ape and his dog named Shep, who is actually an elephant. In the same format as Rocky and Bullwinkle, the show had three segments: George of the Jungle, Tom Slick, and Super Chicken.
Hush!
George, here, twig snap.
Twig! Sounded to me like a safe falling on somebody, a gunshot, and a plane crash.
Very loud twig. Come.
Tom Slick followed a race car driver, his girlfriend Marigold, and his elderly mechanic Gertie Growler. The segment's villain, Baron Automatic, was voiced by Paul Frees. Tom Slick and Marigold's voices were the exact same as Dudley Do-Right and Nell Fenwick's. We have no idea why.
I hope so too, Gertie, but I'll have to beat that evil guy and bad sport Baron Automatic to do it.
Be careful, Tom.
Careful? There's no such word as careful in auto racing, Marigold.
But I love Bill's voice for Gertie Growler, 10 out of 10. Super Chicken followed the escapades of Henry Cabot Henhouse III, voiced by Bill Scott in a Boston Brahmin accent, and his sidekick Fred the Lion, voiced by Paul Frees, impersonating Ed Wynn in a very similar style to his voice for Captain Peach Fuzz. Henry Cabot Henhouse III was based on Henry Cabot Lodge Jr.
Ready? I guess not.
The pilot for George of the Jungle was different too. Hans Conried was the narrator instead of Paul Frees.
It's a well-known fact that all African elephants trumpet. It's a lesser-known fact that they all trumpet in the same key, F sharp. It's a very little-known fact that there's only one elephant in the world that trumpets in a different key, E flat.
And Super Chicken was voiced by Don Knotts instead of Bill Scott.
Drop that gun, you rogue. I have you apprehended.
This looks like a job for Super Chicken.
Unfortunately, these shows didn't become as much as a hit as Rocky and Bullwinkle, but they still remain cult classics to this day.
And then on George of the Jungle, I did George and Tom Slick and Super Chicken.
Let's hear Super Chicken.
You know, the job was dangerous when you took it, Fred.
Let's cast our minds back to 1961 for a bit, with the famous Rocky and Bullwinkle statue. It was first built in 1961 and located in Sunset Boulevard. With most statues, most people leave an imprint of something like their hand or their feet, as well as their signature. But a funny story is that when the statue was completed, Jay offered to have the imprint of the cast members' elbows whilst taking a drink. It was just for a laugh, that's all. Throughout its lifetime, Bullwinkle's shirt has changed 3 times. When it was first built in 1961, he had red and white stripes. When it was repainted in the 1980s, it was given white and blue stripes. And then it got repainted again for what I'm assuming is for the movie back in 2000 or even 2001. This Bullwinkle was given the What's the Matter You t-shirt. But as of the 21st century, the statue has been under disrepair. But there was a little bit of a beacon of light for the statue, but we'll get onto that later.
In 1985, a new show called The Adventures of the Gummy Bears was born, reuniting Bill and June as Gruffy and Grammy Gummy. The Sinister Sculpture episode is definitely an episode where they are predominant on screen. Unfortunately, this would be their last work together, as Bill Scott passed away suddenly from a heart attack on the 29th of November 1985. Paul Frees later followed less than a year later on the 2nd of November 1986. His cause of death was suicide/heart failure. Then, unfortunately, Jay Ward passed away from kidney cancer on the 12th of October 1989. His daughter Tiffany Ward took over as the head of Jay Ward Productions and has been the head since then. All the rights to Ward's shows were purchased by Universal. The big question being was, who was to be the new voice of Bullwinkle? Which brings us onto the subject of Keith Scott. You may know him from the Australian kids show Blinky Bill, or as the original voice of Diesel 10 in Thomas and the Magic Railroad, but he was actually very close to Jay Ward and Bill Scott when he was younger. He was a big fan of the show back when he was just a lad, and it became his mission to find out who these voices were. He first wrote to Dawes Butler, who filled him in on who voiced who in the cartoons. He mentioned him to Bill Scott, who he then wrote to in 1971. Bill then passed Keith's letter on to June Foray. She had heard from a guy also around Keith's age living in Los Angeles. His name was Corey Burton. By then, Keith was in touch with nearly all the staple cast of the Jay Ward shows. Fast forward to 1973, he then won a competition to win a trip to Hollywood, which is where he finally met Corey and his voice acting heroes. He became the official voice of Bullwinkle after Bill Scott's death, after he and Corey were invited to do a recording session for a Rocky and Bullwinkle show or advert with the late, great June Foray. Keith usually plays the Boris, Bullwinkle and or Fearless Leader roles, whilst Corey does the more of a snidely Whiplash role. We sent Keith some questions about Bullwinkle for the documentary and he was more than happy to answer them for us. Bill inspired him to write The Moose That Roared, the official autobiography of Jay Ward Productions. He also said he loved Keith's impression of Bullwinkle, and it was the most accurate one he'd heard, and said maybe one day he might possibly inherit the voice.
But now let's get back to the 1980s with a man called Tad Stones. He was in the works of a Bullwinkle show reboot, and this was long before the Rocky and Bullwinkle reboot by DreamWorks in 2018. However, the idea didn't last long and it was eventually scrapped. This was due to the fact that this reboot was going to be from Disney, and as Disney did not own the rights to Rocky and Bullwinkle, the rights were soon given to Universal in 1989 after the passing of Jay Ward. As for the rest of the cast members, Bill Scott and June Foray would actually be reunited again in 1985, months before Bill Scott's passing. This was during the production of a Disney show called The Adventures of the Gummy Bears. 1992 would also see the release of Boris and Natasha, a direct-to-TV, VHS and DVD spin-off to Rocky and Bullwinkle. This movie is rather interesting because Rocky and Bullwinkle themselves don't actually appear in this movie, but Boris and Natasha are actually referred to as Agents Moose and Squirrel. It's unknown why Rocky and Bullwinkle didn't appear in this movie, but what I do know about this movie is that I've personally never seen it. The only things I know about it is that it centres around Boris and Natasha, and it was narrated by Corey Burton, so I couldn't really give an opinion on this movie. But Amber's seen this movie.
The plot follows Boris, played by Dave Thomas, and Natasha, played by Sally Kellerman, as they try to obtain a time reversal microchip invented by Professor Anton Pavlovich. They are sent away to New York to do the task, where they must fit in with the locals, and also Natasha becomes a superstar. I personally love the film itself, and it certainly gives a different side to the two no-goodniks. The film is available on Amazon Prime if you wish to buy it.
1992 also saw yet another release for Rocky and Bullwinkle, the Rocky and Bullwinkle video game, first released on the NES in 1992. This game was also ported to the Game Boy, the Sega Genesis and the SNES in 1993. This game is pretty much what you would expect from a Rocky and Bullwinkle video game. You play as Rocky and Bullwinkle and you avoid the bad guys, fearless leader Boris and Natasha. During the 80s and 90s, Rocky and Bullwinkle became two of America's most iconic faces, with the reruns on the show now airing on Nickelodeon in 1992 and Cartoon Network in 1997. They would even appear in advertisements such as Taco Bell in 1993 and Energizer in 1995, with the voices provided by June Foray and Keith Scott. But in 2000, our favourite Moose and Squirrel would soon hit the big screens. But not in a good way. In the year 2000, we received The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, Rocky and Bullwinkle's first ever cinematic debut. Amber owns the film on DVD, and I own the film on VHS. This is the only time that Rocky and Bullwinkle was ever released on UK home video. So, what is the story of the film?
The film follows Rocky and Bullwinkle as they go into the human world and help Agent Karen Sympathy, played by Piper Perabo, to stop Fearless Leader from setting up RBTV, an abbreviation of Really Bad Television. The film features a whole bunch of celebrity cameos from people like Whoopi Goldberg, Jonathan Winters, Jonathan Goodman, etc, etc.
Oh my god. Oh my god, it's Rocky and Bullwinkle! Oh my god! I love it! Oh, I love your
Your Honor! The film was produced by Tiffany Ward and Robert De Niro and was directed by Des McGanoff, whose daughter Julia makes a cameo appearance as a young Karen Sympathy. My opinion on the film, it's okay. It's watchable. To be honest, I'd give it a 7 out of 10, but mainly a 7 for the main cast.
In my opinion, whilst the story isn't top notch, it's still interesting to watch. The CGI, despite it looking dated, it was pretty good for the time. The animation in this film is really gorgeous. It's more vibrant and colourful than the original series, and I always have this feeling if Rocky and Bullwinkle ever had a series that ran from the early 2000s, or even the mid 2000s, this is probably what it would look like. The characters were pretty much how they were in the original series, but Rocky was a little bit more cynical than he was in the original, and the casting was actually pretty enjoyable. Overall, I'd probably give it a 7.5 out of 10. It was quite faithful to the original series, with good jokes and bad jokes, but it does have a forgettable story. But at least it is better than a certain other film from 2000. Now onto some trivia. This film heavily implies that this takes place 35 years after the Rocky and Bullwinkle show got cancelled, which leads me to believe that this film was probably supposed to be released in 1999. Production on the film first began in 1998 with a budget of $76 million. As for the actors in the film, they got Robert De Niro to play Fearless Leader, Jason Alexander to play Boris, and Rene Russo to play Natasha. They also got Piper Perabo in this film, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, to play a new character, FBI agent Karen Sympathy.
They also decided to bring back June Frey and Keith Scott as the voices of the main protagonists. I bet Jay Ward and Bill Scott was smiling down on the two of them. Honestly, they did a really great job, honestly. I thought it was Bill Scott doing Bullwinkle's voice. Keith Scott is such a worthy successor.
Whilst on the topic of celebrity cameos, this film had cameos from both Billy Crystal and John Goodman. The reason I bring this up is because in the next year, 2001, they would both go on to be the voices of Mike Wazowski and James P. Sullivan in Disney Pixar's Monsters, Inc. This would have been Keith Scott's second major role in a film from the year 2000. His second one would have been Thomas and the Magic Railroad, as of course he was originally going to be the voice of Diesel 10 in the film. In fact, the Rocky and Bullwinkle movie shares so much in common with this little blue tank engine that it's kind of scary. But believe it or not, this film actually did worse at the box office than Magic Railroad. Where Magic Railroad only made $0.7 million back, Rocky and Bullwinkle got $35 million at the box office, which is extremely poor. On February 13th, 2001, Rocky and Bullwinkle the movie was released on home media, on VHS and DVD. The UK VHS actually had two different covers. One was what I'm assuming is the early version, and then we've got the more modern version in 2001, which is the one that I own. No idea why they changed it. After the movie flopped in 2000, nothing really happened to Rocky and Bullwinkle aside from a few flash animations in 2008, which had the voices of June Foray and Keith Scott.
You could tell all that by smelling a leaf.
No, this is my car.
But with the release of the Peabody and Sherman movie in 2014, there was a little bit of light for Rocky and Bullwinkle, and in 2018, everything for Rocky and Bullwinkle will change.
A short movie titled Another Fine Moose You've Gotten Me Into, or The Man in the Iron Moose, was released in 2014. The film is about Bullwinkle falling in love with an Iron Moose robot set up by Boris, Natasha, and Fearless Leader, and Rocky has to stop the wedding before it's too late. The short was originally going to be shown alongside the film Mr. Peabody and Sherman, as a test to see if they can make it to the big screen one more time. But unfortunately, it was replaced with a short named Almost Home, based on the soon-to-be-released film Home. The film was then released on the 3D Blu-ray DVD copy of Mr. Peabody and Sherman. The short featured June Foray reprising her role as Rocky, Tom Kenny as Bullwinkle, Robert Cate as Boris, Laurie Fraser as Natasha, and Thomas Lennon as Fearless Leader. Unfortunately, this would be June Foray's final appearance as Rocky, as she sadly died 3 years later. After the short movie, 2014 turned into 2015, 2015 turned into 2016, and 2016 turned into 2017. A rumour went around that DreamWorks Animation were developing a revival of the show, set for a 2018 release. Rocky and Bullwinkle still retained a cult following shortly after the short movie's release despite this. Then, on the 12th of April 2018, it was announced that a reboot of the show would be released on Amazon Prime that same year. The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle was released on the streaming platform on the 11th of May 2018. This series marks the first time where Rocky is not voiced by June Foray, excluding Robot Chicken, due to her death the year before. In this show, he is voiced by legendary voice actress Tara Strong. The rest of the cast list was then soon revealed. Brad Norman was to portray Bullwinkle, Ben Diskin was Boris, Rachel Butera was Natasha, Piotr Michael was Fearless Leader, and Darren Norris was the narrator. The news about the reboot didn't please a lot of fans, with some commenting on the lack of compassion for the original series, the design of the characters, and the voice casting, specifically for Bullwinkle. People wanted Keith Scott to voice him, but I personally think Brad Norman did a great job on the portrayal of Bullwinkle. Like the original series, the new show featured different arcs, but only with 4 to 5 episodes in each. Season 1 has so far been released in 2 parts.
Arcs include Stink of Fear, The Dark Side of the Moose, Moose Bumps, Almost for Moose, The Legend of the Power Gems and Amazon Moose, and Squirrel Wonder. The reboot has been nominated for multiple Annie Awards and Daytime Emmy Awards, and has won the Kids Screen Awards of Kids Programming Best New Series.
A lot of new characters were introduced, and a few were changed. The biggest change being to Captain Peter Peachfuzz, who was turned into a woman and renamed Director Peachfuzz for some reason. Was this even necessary, DreamWorks? Come on. The comedic charm of the original character had been taken from this new character and replaced with a strict and smarter attitude. End of comment. Respect my opinion, please.
Gidney and Cloyd were changed from a best friends relationship to a father and son relationship, and they don't even have any dialogue.
In my opinion, this series is okay. It reminds me of Ren and Stimpy at a few points, but this is aimed at children of the modern age, so I'm not really allowed to say anything else. We decided to interview the whole cast for this documentary. Ben, Piotr and Brad were all interviewed by me and the Thomas and TUGS Man over phone call about their time working on the show. Here, have a listen.
You there?
Ben!
Hello?
Hi, Ben!
Hello?
Hey!
Hi.
Yes!
Hey!
Oh my god, it worked! Yay!
Yeah. Woohoo!
Jeez.
Oh my word.
Oh, bubbling boilers.
Wow. That is the most British thing I've heard all day, and I just spoke to a British guy.
Bust my buffers, said Thomas.
He's referencing Thomas. How did you manage to get the role of Boris Badenoff for the Rocky and Bullwinkle reboot on Amazon Prime?
Sure. So I got the role of Boris Badenoff because basically we all audition for this stuff. It's usually the same kind of answer for any how did you get this role thing is people sent me an audition and I tried out for it and I got it. But this one was a little bit different because there was an original pilot that was done, I believe, close to a year before casting for the actual show began. So a lot of us were auditioning for roles that we'd already auditioned for. And so for me, I was like, I remember getting the audition sides and going, oh, I guess we're doing Rocky and Bullwinkle again. Whatever happened to that last one? They liked what I did. They had me come in and audition for it as a callback in person. For that one, I did my first take. And they said, "Oh, we really like that. Do you have anything else you'd like to try?" And I said, "No, I think I'm good." And by the way, that's usually the worst answer you can possibly give. Usually in an audition process, if they say like, "Do you have anything else?" that means we really didn't like what you did. Maybe you have something else that we might like. That's what that's code for. But I genuinely just didn't have anything else other than what I did. So I was just like, nope. And they're like, all right. And I left and I went, well, I didn't get that one. What are you going to do? And then a while later, I got contacted by my agency saying, actually, you did get that one. And I went, yeah, okay, cool. And so that's how that went down. I actually did grow up watching Rocky and Bullwinkle. I would catch all of the reruns on, I think it was either, for me in the States, it was either Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network. I don't really remember which one. But it was like all of the older cartoons. I think it was Cartoon Network, if I recall correctly. And this was a show that was like this wasn't like one of those things that like my dad watched when he was a kid, like the original Looney Tunes and stuff. So this was something that he was only kind of sort of aware of, but knew enough of. I think he was probably around 20 when the show came out. So I didn't really have any connection to the original stuff. It was just, to me, this is a show on TV and I like it. And I didn't understand like, oh, this is from the 60s and all of these references were like to like the Cold War. And that's why like the quote unquote Potsylvanian spies are actually Russian. I'm like, oh, okay. Like all the political stuff went right over my head as a kid. So I just thought it was a funny cartoon show. But yeah, I did grow up with the original.
But this time you gotta change your voice because these are questions for Boris Badenoff.
What can Boris do for you?
Oh, God!
Would you consider Natasha as your wife or your partner or something like that?
My wife? Ugh. You have any idea how horrible it would be for me? Sheesh, she drives me crazy.
How did you manage to get the role of Fearless Leader in the reboot?
Well, like any role in most animated productions, you have to audition. And so they sent out a casting call, and they listed the 4 characters for the show. Of course, Bullwinkle, Rocky, Fearless Leader, and Boris. And Natasha, they did not give an option for me. I don't think they wanted to go with a woman. But I auditioned for Boris Badenoff, and I auditioned for Fearless Leader because I thought to myself, if I audition for Bullwinkle, there's no way I'm going to get it because they're going to give it to Tom Kenny. They're going to give it to, somebody big. And so I just thought to myself, you know what? I like the kooky, crazy characters. So, of course, if I was going to do someone, I would do Boris Bedinov.
Oh my
Or
god,
I'll
that
do
does sound like a
Fearless
cool
Leader.
freeze, Boris.
And so when I audition for the show, the first thing that they ask for is for you to match the original from the 60s.
And so they asked to match the original voice from the 1960s show. And that's what I did first. And then I think they asked for a second take, asking for your approach to it. And I think I added a little more spin to it. And from that, they said, hey, we like your audition. Why don't you come in to do a callback, which is essentially a second audition live in front of the producers and writers and showrunners, just so that they can get a sense of you in the room. And also callbacks typically have more leeway where the creative staff wants to experiment a little bit with the character because they sense something in your voice, but they want to push you and say, let's see how far we can go with this guy. And I remember I auditioned as if I was just reciting my submitted tape, in the same exact tone, like,
hello, it's me, Fearless Leader. Oh no, that Rocky and Bullwinkle. I'm going to get them. Oh, send the rockets.
And then they said, oh, wow. Oh, my gosh, that was great. Thank you so much. If that's it, we'll see you later. And I said, well, can I just do one more just for fun? And they said, sure, okay. So the second one was me being very, very crazy, going up and down
as Fearless Leader.
And from that, I was fortunate enough to get the gig. And it was very lucky.
Can we just quickly hear your Boris and Bullwinkle impressions, if you don't mind?
Oh, of course. If I just did Bullwinkle, he would sound like this.
Oh, that reminds me of Keith Scott.
Boris Bedinov.
Your Bullwinkle reminds me of a mix of Tom Kenny and Keith Scott.
Well, if I did do that, it would probably be because I grew up on the Keith Scott version of the Bullwinkle.
I did as well, to be fair. I think they aired Rocky and Bullwinkle on Boomerang in the UK a few years back, and I do remember watching the show.
Yes, I did watch, and my girlfriend's a big fan of the show, so we have some of the compilations on collected DVDs, and so we watched some of those shows with all the shorts, and so and Fearless Leader actually doesn't show up on the show until later in the series.
Yeah, and Jet Fuel Formula. I mean, he actually does go through a few changes. Like the first time we saw him, he was in a trench coat and sunglasses, and then he was fat. Excuse my language.
Hey, listen, I was really into pastries at that time, and I had to stop and realize it's time for smoothies. Green herbal smoothies.
And then he went to slim again, and then he became the Fearless Leader we all know and love today.
Green jacket.
Yep. Sometimes blue as well, because in the movie he has a blue jacket as well, so yeah. Okay, Brad, I've got to ask you this. How did you get the voice of Bullwinkle?
It's a pretty traditional Hollywood story. I just sent in an audition, and they, they liked it. That the ward seemed to really like it. I found out much later that the ward liked my audition, and DreamWorks was nice enough to cast me.
Do you have any experience with Rocky and Bullwinkle? Did you go with the reboot? I mean, not reboot.
Yeah. Reruns.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yes. No, that's okay. I grew up in Detroit, and I actually saw the reruns on Canadian television.
Canadian television?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Despite being in Detroit.
Yes, right, because we were so close to Canada that we used to get a television station from Windsor, and Windsor just happened to be the one that broadcast the old Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons. It was like the Incredible Hulk reruns, a Star Trek rerun, and a Rocky and Bullwinkle rerun, and then it was pretty much time to do my homework.
Are we receiving Bullwinkle? Are you on the line somewhere, or?
Yes, hello.
Hi.
It's Bullwinkle J Moose, everybody.
Greetings, audiophiles.
Hello.
Hello there.
Okay, Bullwinkle, how did you first meet Rocky, if you do remember far back then?
I think the first time I met Rock, we were at a business convention in Salt Lake City. It was something for desalination at the time. Or, no, wait, maybe that was a different guy, Gordon David Johnson. Yeah, okay, so you mean Rocky the Squirrel?
Yes.
Well, Rock and I lived in the same little hometown, and we had our very first adventure when we were just trying to get to the school bus. Ever
Ooh.
since then, we've been inseparable.
Honestly, that's cute. Like, I want a friendship just like Rocky and Bullwinkle. Definitely. Unfortunately, we have not yet interviewed Tara because of her busy schedule. However, her interview will be released very soon as an add-on to this documentary, so stay tuned. We interviewed Rachel too, but the file became corrupted, so we are planning to re-record the interview soon. Those two interviews will be out very, very soon. Continuing on from the statue, a campaign was started to get the statue back on Sunset Boulevard. Brad and Tara went to a conference to try and get it back. And it worked! The statue will be coming back hopefully in 2020. And there you have it, 60 years of Rocky and Bullwinkle and their friends jam-packed into one YouTube documentary. The legacy of Jay Ward and his creations live on in our memories and our hearts.
It's been a huge roller coaster, but we are proud to call ourselves fans of the show. Thank you all so much for watching this documentary, and a special thanks goes out to all the people who helped us with this. For now, we'll see you all around, everyone. Bye!
You got the credits, Bullwinkle?
All on this itty-bitty card. Oop!
We're late again, Bullwinkle.
Right.
Bye now. See you next time.